The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the LDS Church or the Mormon Church, is perhaps the most conservative church in the United States. According to a recent study done by the Pew Research Center, 70% of the church's membership consider themselves conservative. This is most likely because of the church's stance on gay marriage and abortion. But is it possible to be a faithful member of the church and have liberal views that seem to differ from the church's conservative teachings? To help answer this question, I interviewed 3 members of the church, 2 who consider themselves liberal, and 1 who considers himself a classical liberal.
I consider myself a liberal because I believe that the government has a place in our lives, that it is a regulatory agency and it can help us to improve our lives and to improve the quality of other people's lives.
I don't know that I am at that end of the spectrum. I have very liberal friends who probably consider me conservative, but I think that my views have shifted that way a little bit in the last few years.
I identify myself as a classical liberal because of my developing political views. It's very much about personal liberty. I mean, even the word liberalism, the root of that is liberty, so freedom. It's all about your right to life, liberty, and property. Those are the big 3.
I think my political views developed in home. My parents never made politics a secret or anything like that. It was something that we could discuss at the dinner table. It was something that my teachers through high school and things like that encouraged us to talk and debate.
They've changed over time as I've kind of studied and looked through the different political ideologies of the various parties. Seen inconsistencies in all of them and kind of diverged myself from them and thought to myself, okay, what are my personal values? What really speaks to me?
My parents were a big influence on developing my political views. They're both very active in their political beliefs. We watched political debates growing up and I took notes like a nerd, but I took notes. And we would have those discussions over dinner. We'd talk about new legislation that was coming through and how it would affect us.
I think within the church there's a certain culture. And church members, largely 80% of them obviously, feel like the Republican Party or whatever best represents that culture. And in some cases they may be right, in some cases I think they're wrong. But largely, I think it's a culture issue.
I think that more people in the Mormon Church would consider themselves liberals if they took abortion and gay marriage and family issues out of the equation, because those are things that we fundamentally disagree with liberals on in a religious perspective. But if you can separate your religious perspective from what the law can do, then it's easier to sort of understand what's going on.
I think that polarization has a big part to play in why only 20% of Mormons consider themselves Democrats or liberals. I also think that the church has a very long-standing history of not necessarily being political, but I think one of the things that the church really encourages is self-sufficiency, which I think is a really important value. And I think that sometimes the idea of self-sufficiency can go very, very far, to the point that it breaks my heart a little bit. But I've seen some Mormons when someone maybe says, you know, I'm in favor of not necessarily socialized medicine, but Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act, that some of them will respond, why should I have to take care of you and your healthcare needs? And to me, I think that in some ways that's almost that we've taken this idea of self-sufficiency too far, when ultimately the goal of self-sufficiency in the church is to be able to take care of ourselves so that we can also take care of our neighbor.
I know that the belief of gay marriage and abortion is against the teachings of the church, and I agree that those things, as far as God's laws go, is absolutely correct. They're not appropriate and we shouldn't have them. However, humans are really bad at following God's laws. And if someone doesn't believe that that is a law we have to abide by, then we can't force them to do so. And we believe in agency in our church as well. And so that's where my ability to be a liberal at the same time as being a Mormon comes from. I understand that there's a separation between what the church wants for me and what the state can do.
So on the issue of abortion, first and foremost, I think it's very important that people who are vehemently anti-abortion recognize that pretty much everybody is against the practice of abortion. To me, abortion is an abomination. It's nothing short of that. And in the same way that walking up to somebody in the street and shooting them with a gun is murder, I consider abortion to be the same thing. By that same token, I think that there are times that people need to be able to defend themselves with a gun against harm or loss of property or life. And I think that abortion, it can fulfill that need in some instances. And if you look at the way that the church views abortion, it very strongly states that abortion for the purpose of birth control is not okay, but that there are instances that are a little bit more nuanced, that women should have the opportunity to be able to make that decision for their family with their leaders and with the Lord. I think that government is not always good at granting or protecting rights, but it is good at injecting balance into the discussion. And so in this respect, I think that we have to be careful as Latter-day Saints that we aren't projecting our values onto other people and forcing them to live in a way that we think is acceptable. In that way, I think that government can be good at injecting balance, and I think that we really have to carefully walk this line of personal freedom and religious freedom. And I think that sometimes in the liberal conservative discussion, those get a little bit muddled, and I think that it's about preserving both kinds of freedom.
When it comes to policies like gay marriage or abortion, you have really two different schools, or two different ideals. You have your moral beliefs as a member of the church, and you have your political beliefs, your social values, etc. I think if you're going to say, okay, we're going to keep marriage as a government institution, you have, in order for your spouse or your significant other, whoever, to receive whatever Social Security benefits you may have paid into that are still owed to you, etc., you have to have this federally legally binding document to say who gets that. Well, then that needs to be open to everybody. Now, if you're talking about marriage as a religious institution, then of course that boils down to the way that our Heavenly Father instituted marriage. So you have really what's the difference between civil unions and marriage as a religious institution, which are two very different things. One is a legal contract that decides who gets what when you die. The other is a eternally binding covenant. So in terms of abortion, well, that again is a right to life. I mean, you have, some say it's a right to liberty, right? The right to choose, but it's not just your choice. You're making the choice for a human. And for me personally, that amounts to murder. If you're going to make it legal, which, the cat's out of the bag on that one, I don't think it's ever going to get in the bag. It's hard to put a prohibition on something that's already been legalized. In that case, it shouldn't be funded by government. That becomes legalized murder. At what point are you going to say, no, we're not going to do that?
These members of the church have revealed that just because you consider yourself a liberal, it doesn't necessarily mean you agree with all liberal views. It means you believe in agency and the ability to choose. So can you be a liberal and a faithful member of the church? Yes, you can, even if some members might never agree.
When people tell you you can't be a good member of the church and believe and be in favor of liberty and freedom, they're wrong. But I think you can tell them that in a loving way, and I think you can, agree to disagree with them. What they think about you isn't going to determine where you end up. They don't get to judge you at the final judgment, so what does it matter what they think?